What if your own brain turned against you? What if the voices in your head weren't just thoughts, but commands? What if reality itself warped and twisted until you couldn't trust anything, not even your closest friends? This is a world experienced by millions, and understanding it means facing some of the most bizarre, shocking, and heartbreaking moments in human history and science. Stick around, because we're uncovering the secrets of schizophrenia. It was the beginning of the 19th century. The British Empire, while conquering its colonies, saw things progressing as usual. Alongside this, industry was actively developing. The first factories with machines appeared: metallurgy, coal mining, and especially textile manufacturing. John Kay's flying shuttle, James Hargreaves' spinning jenny, Edmund Cartwright's power loom. Strangely enough, it was progress in the textile industry that spurred many other sectors forward. Meanwhile, their favorite neighbors, the French, had recently gone through the Great French Revolution and, with it, the Reign of Terror led by the Jacobins. They were terrorizing anyone suspected of counter-revolutionary activities. And around this time, a former prominent English merchant, a man named James Tilly Matthews, complained that people, French Jacobins, were tormenting and torturing him using one of the new pneumatic textile machines. Matthews managed to identify his tormentors. They were Sir Archie, the glove woman, and King Bill. The criminals' goal? Mind reading and mind control. What's most horrifying is that Matthews wasn't the only one subjected to such torment. Leading statesmen and ministers were too, including the then Prime Minister, William Pitt. The machine, by the way, supposedly looked like this. Imagine showing a drawing or animation. Here we can see the person controlling it and a few bewildered, irradiated victims. The gang was also allegedly responsible for many political events, such as the invasion of Buenos Aires in 1807 or the unsuccessful British Walcheren expedition against Napoleon. I should mention that a few years prior, James Matthews had traveled to France, hoping to prevent war between Britain and France. He actually managed to begin negotiations, but then a coup happened in France. The Jacobins seized power, and Matthews was arrested. After 3 years of imprisonment, upon returning to London, Matthews began behaving strangely, to say the least. He wrote letters to lords accusing them of treason and interrupted a House of Commons session, shouting about being betrayed. This led to him being confined to a psychiatric asylum. There, he complained about being abandoned on an important government mission in France and blamed the government administration, and that same William Pitt, yes, the one also allegedly tortured by the heirloom machine. In other respects, until the end of his life, Matthews appeared quite lucid. He helped the institution where he was observed with accounting and even participated in the restoration of a psychiatric asylum in London. Nevertheless, James Tilly Matthews' story became the first documented case that might resemble schizophrenia. Salute, Earthlings. The Time Cabinet is with you. You know, when I was studying medicine, I was really struck by a rotation where we visited people with mental illness, though that term is outdated, by the way. Our professor let us talk to a woman with schizophrenia. My group and another, 2 whole groups, couldn't figure out what was wrong with her for a whole hour. When the professor returned and helped us, we were all, admittedly, a bit shocked by our inexperience. How had we not recognized the delusion? I'll talk more about that later. But because of that experience, I've wanted to make something like this about this mysterious illness for a long time. A disease that is still not fully understood and is explained more by hypotheses than theories. And that's what stopped me too. What could I even talk about if nothing is clear? It's because schizophrenia is a cluster of different disorders. Everyone experiences them in different combinations, and they manifest differently. There is no, and has never been, one identical case of schizophrenia. But despite all this, and despite the fact that even the most brilliant neurobiologists don't fully grasp its mechanisms, people love to talk about it. They love to use it jokingly or to insult someone. I'm so schizo, he's a schizoid, and so on. People label someone, for example, just because they think or say something unhealthy, calling them some kind of schizophrenic. But all this comes from a vague understanding of what it is. Let's try to put together what we do know. We'll learn why delusions and hallucinations are still far from the full picture of schizophrenia, what schizophrenia and LSD have in common, how it was treated in the 20th century, what dangers it can pose, and what potential positives might exist. And of course, why it's so incredibly difficult to study. Plus, there will be many stories today. Let's go. It's interesting that for a long time, schizophrenia wasn't distinguished as a separate mental peculiarity. Firstly, because in many cultures, like India or China, manifestations of mental illness were attributed to evil spirits and demons. Accordingly, methods for studying or treating the disease were, well, you can imagine. And secondly, understanding of mental disorders was very limited for a long time. For example, Hippocrates talked about melancholia. He probably would have called it something the Zoomers came up with today, but he didn't. He said that all diseases were due to an imbalance of humoral fluids. Melancholia, a state of depression and anxiety, included symptoms like sadness, apathy, insomnia, etc., according to him. So, if you had too much yellow bile in your body, you just needed to let it out, and everything would be fine. Or for mania, a state of excessive excitement, hyperactivity, impulsive behavior, Hippocrates believed it was caused by black bile. Those were the times. Something similar to schizophrenia was first described only in the early Middle Ages in the canon of medicine by the Persian physician and philosopher Avicenna. He described junun mufrid, or acute madness, hallucinations, delusions, disorganized thinking, and illogical behavior. Relying on Hippocrates' work, he also linked this to an imbalance of humoral fluids and compared acute madness to, well, essentially melancholia and mania combined. Interestingly, Kandinsky diagnosed himself with this. He suffered from acute psychoses, was hospitalized multiple times in psychiatric institutions, and he suggested treating idiophrenia with opium in large doses, which he also practiced on himself. But understandably, the substance only worsened everything, and he had a very tragic end. Meanwhile, in Europe, the understanding of schizophrenia evolved along its own path. The precursor came in the mid-19th century with the concept of dementia praecox, early dementia, from the French. This term first arose to describe the condition of a 14-year-old boy who started losing his mental and communication abilities so early. In 1893, a psychiatrist named Emil Kraepelin expanded this term. He decided that manifestations of youthful dementia could include hebephrenia, where an adult behaves childishly and foolishly, engaging in silly pranks and inappropriate behavior. Mind, soul, thinking. We'll just remember this gibberish again. Kraepelin also believed that precursors to this dementia could be catatonia, where a person falls into a physical or emotional stupor, and paranoia, where a person is simply delusional. Kraepelin considered all these seemingly different things to be united by the fact that they irreversibly led to dementia. However, quite quickly, just over 100 years ago, a Swiss scientist, Eugen Bleuler, took a more positive view of this disorder. Firstly, he said that these conditions were not directly related to dementia. Leave that for the elderly, he essentially said. And dementia wasn't necessarily the outcome, as the illness was generally unpredictable. What actually unites these conditions, he argued, is splitting. This is where the history of the illness you've heard of begins, schizophrenia. Bleuler suggested this name, combining the Greek words schizo, split, and phren, mind or soul. So schizophrenia translates to splitting of the mind, or even more poetically, splitting of the soul. Splitting in this context is when you are simultaneously certain of two conclusions that contradict each other, or you experience two opposing feelings, or you make two opposite decisions, ultimately refusing to choose. Bleuler considered this to be the main characteristic of the disorder. However, even though it's in the name, splitting is not considered the primary symptom today. The disorder can manifest in different ways. Besides splitting, Bleuler also talked about manifestations like autism, social withdrawal, affect, lack of outward emotions or inappropriate random emotions, and thought disorder, chaotic, illogical thinking, precisely the schizophasia I mentioned earlier. The scientist neatly called this concept the 4 A's, and generally the psychiatric community was quite taken with his theory, and since then it became official, and the disorder became known by the name Bleuler proposed, schizophrenia. The topic continued to be studied. In the early 20th century, it was also discovered that schizophrenia is hereditary. This led to a horrifying trend in psychiatry, the sterilization of anyone diagnosed with it. And this wasn't just in Nazi Germany, as you might assume, but in countries like the USA, Canada, and Scandinavian countries. Of course, it was harshest in Germany until 1945, where the T4 program, which I've mentioned before, was in effect. Under this program, people with mental disorders were simply quietly eliminated. Nevertheless, in other countries, although the process was milder, it lasted for a much longer period, only ending in the 1970s. So innocent people, essentially, suffered incredibly. And this isn't even mentioning the horrors of the treatments themselves, which I intend to discuss today. But I want to start with the symptoms and talk primarily about those that shape our common perception of schizophrenia: hallucinations and delusions. Anna and Alexander were best friends since childhood. From playing in the sandbox to swinging on the swings, their friendship deepened. They could talk for hours, play, and share secrets. But over time, Alexander began behaving strangely and frighteningly. "Society is influencing us badly," he'd say from conversations. When Anna turned 18, her world began to crumble. She often argued with her parents, who didn't approve of Alexander. Desperate, Anna found solace in his company, but his stories grew darker. He spoke of the apocalypse and strange conspiracies. At 20, Anna was diagnosed with schizophrenia. She began to recover, and one day she filmed Alexander with her camera. Only a wall was visible in the video. A few days later, she was found in the woods and had no memory of how she got there. In a psychotic episode, she called her mother and babbled about goats. Anna was sent to a psychiatric hospital, isolated from the outside world, and the only one who agreed to stay with her was Alexander. This story is actually fictional, or rather, a composite, but it's very typical for those suffering from schizophrenia who experience hallucinations, one of the most popular and vivid symptoms of this disorder. And probably the most famous story was shown in the movie A Beautiful Mind. The film tells the story of the great mathematician John Nash, who received the Nobel Prize in Economics for his work on game theory, as well as the Abel Prize, and made significant contributions to economics, political science, and everything related to strategy. In the film, we see the scientist being pursued by visions. Firstly, a secret agent in a black hat who draws Nash into espionage. Secondly, as hard as it is for the hero or the audience to realize, his best friend since college, and also the friend's little niece. According to the plot, these were all hallucinations that the hero perceived as reality for many years. In real life, of course, Nash's hallucinations were primarily auditory, voices that criticized his ideas. Which is not surprising, because auditory hallucinations, not visual ones, are the most common type of hallucination in schizophrenia. 3,000 years ago, if you heard a voice in your head every day saying something like, "I am the spirit of the moon speaking through you," "Let the tribe dance all night to summon the rain," or "From now on, the connection with the gods is open to you, and you shall be a shaman, healer, or sorcerer," especially if you were lucky and it actually rained a few days later, you might become a revered figure. However, with the development of modern science, all this began to be perceived somewhat differently. A typical example: a person hears a voice telling them to avoid certain people who are plotting against them and that they are in danger. The worst is when the voices insistently suggest something, for example, that the person shouldn't live for some reason, or ask them to commit something extraordinarily terrible. And here's a story from my own life. When I was a kid, I did swimming. At some point, specifically in marathons, you had to swim for hours in a lake, following a route around large orange and white striped buoys, several meters tall. I still remember them clearly. It really took, say, half an hour to an hour to swim to a buoy. I don't remember now. And you'd swim like this with your snorkel down, looking into absolute darkness, nothing else there. Every few minutes, you'd lift your head to check what was ahead and keep swimming so you didn't go off course. Well, towards the end of one marathon, I clearly saw that the buoys had grown arms and were waving at me like this. I quit swimming after that. And it's because hallucinations and other symptoms of schizophrenia are by no means exclusive to schizophrenia. And I'd like to give a few examples of hallucinations not related to the illness, because the mechanism and the images can often be similar. only the causes differ. What I experienced in my swimming example is a hallucination caused by sensory deprivation. In the 1950s, an experiment was conducted where students were placed in soundproof chambers and also wore goggles that allowed them to distinguish only light and darkness. After some time, the exact duration is unknown, every single person inevitably began to experience visual hallucinations. Some saw strange, intricate patterns, others saw more complex images that became three-dimensional over time. Some saw a procession of squirrels wearing tiny spacesuits. The hallucinations only stopped if the subjects were asked to solve an analytical problem. But if they were simply talked to, the hallucination continued to live its own independent life. Later, scientists realized that you didn't need special chambers to achieve this effect, just visual deprivation was enough. It's no wonder, then, that they also discovered a link between this effect and Charles Bonnet syndrome. This syndrome was described back in 1760, and the man it was named after, Charles Bonnet himself, discovered it thanks to his grandfather. His grandfather, who suffered from cataracts, had eye surgery, after which he experienced various hallucinations, which he described to his grandson. Sometimes it was a large blue handkerchief floating in the air, sometimes colorful landscapes. Once he saw himself, but not in a mirror. It's written that this is a common experience among elderly people. It's diagnosed in 10 to 15% of cases where vision is severely impaired. But the true number is likely much higher because, well, in your right mind, would you tell people you were seeing hallucinations? Simplifying significantly, the essence here is this. Due to vision problems, the visual cortex of the brain receives fewer signals. In response, it sort of panics, becomes hyperactive, and spontaneously activates without any information coming from outside. It's interesting that in the 1990s, when MRI became available, scientists were able to prove that visual hallucinations and visual imagination are not the same thing. They observed that during hallucinations, activity was seen in the occipital and lower temporal lobes, which process external information. But when a person was asked to imagine a scene, activity appeared in the frontal cortex, which is responsible for complex scenarios and planning. Perhaps this discovery can help us better understand the mechanism of hallucinations in schizophrenia. For some reason, the visual cortex is also overexcited. Anyway, you definitely can't cause genuine hallucinations just by imagining things. And that's what makes them interesting. They aren't under our voluntary control because they aren't formed by what we imagine. Besides visual issues, hallucinations can arise from a ton of other things. Severe infections, other psychological conditions like PTSD, they can even occur with depression, and of course, due to psychoactive substances, including alcohol withdrawal, seeing pink elephants. So, the underlying causes are different, but the physiological reason is essentially the same. Abnormal activity in the brain areas responsible for processing information. What are delusions? A classic example of delusion. German psychologist Karl Jaspers defined delusion this way. It's when you are certain about something, that something does not correspond to reality, and nevertheless your belief is completely unshakable and resistant to correction. No matter how much you try to prove otherwise, what logical arguments or literal evidence you provide, none of it will change the conviction. James Tilly Matthews, whom I told you about at the beginning with the heirloom tortures, also had delusions, possibly reinforced by his imprisonment and stress. And in A Beautiful Mind, John Nash's paranoid delusions are well depicted. In real life, John Nash did indeed write numerous letters to the government proposing changes to information encryption methods. He was convinced that the entire world was a threat to America, and when he saw someone wearing a red tie, he thought they were part of a communist conspiracy. This is, in fact, the most common type of delusion, persecutory delusion, delusions of grandeur and famous cases. In second place after persecutory delusions is grandiose delusion. You've probably heard old jokes about psychiatric hospitals filled with Napoleon, Alexander the Great, and even God himself. These jokes aren't just made up. For example, Friedrich Nietzsche, towards the end of his life, also suffered from a mental disorder. We don't have a definitive diagnosis, so there could have been many causes, from syphilis affecting the brain to paranoid schizophrenia. Anyway, He had an episode in the asylum where, in a state of manic excitement, he declared himself first the Duke of Cumberland, then the Emperor. It's interesting that he didn't declare himself the Übermensch, Superman, a concept from his philosophy. So, yes, people with grandiose delusions are capable of active deeds, and sometimes they feel absolutely obligated to do something extraordinary in their lives and make history. In 1976, Martin Scorsese's film Taxi Driver was released. The main character, Travis, is a taxi driver, and at one point, he picks up a 12-year-old who is involved in sex work, played by Jodie Foster. The taxi driver decides to save her. However, he doesn't succeed. The girl says she supposedly loves her pimp. Then Travis decides he is a messiah and begins to clean up the city from the scum. First, he shoots a robber, then plans to do the same to a politician, and finally goes to the brothel where Jodie Foster worked to dispense justice. The John Hinckley Jr. story. But this movie caused public uproar, not just with its plot. On May 30th, 1981, President Reagan was leaving the Hilton Hotel in Washington, and shots rang out. Fortunately for Reagan, he was only injured, but one of his press secretaries suffered a serious head injury. This was, by the way, the last assassination attempt on a U.S. president, if you know what I mean. The shooter on that distant day was a 26-year-old man named John Hinckley Jr. 5 years before the assassination attempt, he watched Taxi Driver and became obsessed with Jodie Foster. He started stalking her, moved to the city where she studied, enrolled in the same university, wrote her notes, called her. Nothing worked. Then he decided he would get her attention in some extraordinary way, but he couldn't choose between hijacking a plane or committing harakiri in front of her. And then the movie gave him a hint. Hinckley decided he would, so to speak, attempt to assassinate a president for love. For love of someone who wasn't asking for any of this. At that time, the president was Jimmy Carter, and while Hinckley was preparing for the attempt, drawing plans and so on, he was arrested for violating gun laws and also sent for treatment for depression. During his treatment, a new president came into office, Reagan, and he was a little less lucky because Hinckley didn't get better. During the trial, he was diagnosed with narcissistic and schizoid personality disorders, and his lawyer insisted that Hinckley also had schizophrenia. Anyway, he was found not guilty by reason of insanity and placed in a psychiatric hospital. After 34 years of confinement, he was released. For several years, Hinckley wasn't allowed to use social media. In 2020, the ban was lifted, and he immediately started a YouTube channel. You can look it up. It's just called John Hinckley, the only one with subscribers, by the way. And here's my point. This isn't like what we talked about before. Nothing vivid, no hallucinations, no delusions in any form. And that's because schizophrenia actually manifests in two seemingly opposite ways. There are positive symptoms, which I talked about earlier, hallucinations, motor activity, delusional states, something active. And there are negative symptoms, the opposite, passive, apathy, emotional blunting, social isolation. And while with positive symptoms there's a stream of words, here there's an inability to speak. A person's phrases become short, monosyllabic. When vivid active symptoms predominate, it's called paranoid schizophrenia. When negative symptoms predominate, it's simple type schizophrenia. Hebephrenic schizophrenia is also identified. Remember I mentioned it earlier? This is a disorder with a regression to childhood, foolishness, silly pranks, inappropriate behavior. That's all hebephrenic type symptoms. Catatonia, the Samara legend. But besides these, another type of schizophrenia is identified, characterized by a very unusual phenomenon. In 1956 in Samara, then the city of Kuibyshev, a group of young people gathered to celebrate New Year's. Youth, first loves, naturally everyone came in pairs. Everyone except a girl named Zoya. Zoya had invited a certain Nikolay, whom she'd met the day before, but Nikolay didn't show up. Imagine how that feels for a young girl, practically rejected right before New Year's Eve, without a word and the only one without a partner. So, when the dancing started, Zoya grabbed an icon and shouted, "Since my Nikolay isn't here, I'll dance with St. Nicholas the Wonder Worker." Everyone started telling Zoya, "That's a sin," to which she replied, "If it's a sin, let God punish me." She pressed the icon to her chest and had just stepped onto the dance floor when she froze like a statue. She couldn't be moved, and the icon, couldn't be taken from her hands. What is catatonia? Catatonia is actually a relatively rare symptom in schizophrenia. When it does occur, it manifests as alternating episodes of stupor. During stupor, a person can remain motionless for several days. Sometimes a symptom called waxy flexibility accompanies this. This is when a person is lying down, and you, for example, lift their head, and it stays in that position you lifted it to, even without support, for a long time. Or the person completely complies with anything done to their body. During catatonic episodes, there might be some visions, not quite hallucinations, as they are more like dreams. Even without understanding the causes of schizophrenia, you can say that this looks very much like a peculiar defense mechanism, perhaps against an aggressive, unpleasant external world. But this can be replaced by the opposite: excessive excitement or agitation, with bizarre or overly sharp, impulsive, and even aggressive movements. These are still far from all the symptoms that can occur in catatonic schizophrenia. Emotionality can also be present, like hebephrenic foolishness. Different forms of schizophrenia overlap and intertwine, so catatonic stupor or excitement alone doesn't necessarily mean schizophrenia. It can be a side effect of certain substances, for example, or a manifestation of other mental or non-mental illnesses. Diagnosing schizophrenia. The difficulty. So how do you know if it's schizophrenia? Well, we'll get to that. As I said, schizophrenia is still not fully understood, to the extent that it's not 100% clear whether it's one disorder or several combined. As we've seen, it manifests differently in everyone, and sometimes with opposite or contradictory symptoms. That's why scientists think the issue lies in the dopaminergic and glutamatergic systems in the brain. The risk of developing schizophrenia increases if close relatives, such as parents or siblings, have the disorder. The risks are roughly as follows: around 6% if a parent has it, 9% if siblings have it, and so on. A vivid example is that John Nash's son was also diagnosed with schizophrenia. This happened in adolescence. John Charles Martin Nash spoke of hearing voices and believing that God was talking to him. He also experienced visual hallucinations, as shown in the film about his father. Diagnosing schizophrenia, the tests, and the feeling. Now, arguably the most interesting part: is there any tool or analysis that can definitively diagnose schizophrenia? We can't scan the brain and know. There's no way to identify a schizophrenia gene. There's no 100% or even 80% accurate test to make everything clear right away. Although, surprisingly, such tests constantly circulate online. For example, in the 1970s, British neuropsychologist Richard Gregory proposed the Chaplin mask test, where the concave side of the mask is perceived as convex by healthy people, while people with schizophrenia see it as it is. The logic was that, as we know, processing of visual information is often impaired in schizophrenia, leading to a lack of perception of certain visual illusions. So they thought this could be used for diagnosis. However, this test is of course maximally unreliable. Again, because schizophrenia varies greatly, not all people with schizophrenia have visual distortions, and conversely, this impaired illusion perception can occur for reasons other than schizophrenia. Therefore, schizophrenia is diagnosed according to the ICD-10 criteria. For a diagnosis, there must be 2 minor symptoms and 1 major symptom. For instance, if you have apathy and loss of interest, plus voices, you would be diagnosed with schizophrenia. However, these symptoms must last for longer than 1 month. If less, it's diagnosed as acute schizophrenia like psychotic disorder. But frankly, who cares about ICD or Chaplin masks? No irony here. Psychiatrists have a concept called the feeling of schizophrenia. It was first described by a German psychiatrist in 1941, characterizing it as an indescribable intuition where, through experience, you observe a person's specific posture, speech, and facial movements, and you begin to sense that something is fundamentally off. Interestingly, recent surveys show that up to 92% of psychiatrists consider this method of diagnosis reliable. It's quite a diagnostic method. Although there are known cases where initially healthy people came to psychiatrists saying something was wrong, and the psychiatrists started believing that something indeed was wrong with them. Treatment history, a difficult road. I mentioned at the very beginning how unlucky those born with schizophrenia in the early or mid-20th century were, when methods were far from humane and sterilization was practiced in some countries. And can you imagine if you weren't born with it at all, but were mistakenly diagnosed, which was easy to do, or even if it wasn't a mistake? They were doubly unlucky because the treatment methods were no less horrifying. Initially, of course, no one knew how to treat this mysterious condition. I've mentioned Eugen Bleuler several times today. Being familiar with Sigmund Freud's psychoanalysis, he even wrote about its application in treating this disorder. In short, psychoanalysis allows the patient to talk about whatever comes to mind, or even remain silent if they prefer, and over time, after numerous sessions, this leads to processing and healing. Well, for mental illnesses like schizophrenia, Bleuler proposed in one work dedicating himself to oudinotherapy. Oudeno from ancient Greek means nothing. Simply put, it means non-interference in the natural course of the illness. Whatever that was supposed to mean, Bleuler believed it could lead to healing, but he wasn't without his contradictions. Although this treatment seemed simple, doing nothing, he also advocated for sterilization, saying that those severely affected by illness should not have offspring. If we allow physically and mentally impaired individuals to have children, while healthy ones refrain for the sake of helping others, if we suppress natural selection, our race will quickly deteriorate. By the way, his sister had schizophrenia, which he himself diagnosed. On the other hand, Bleuler spoke about the potential unsafety of electroshock therapy and didn't trust medications, saying that pharmacologists usually only published positive test results, ignoring negative ones. In short, a very contradictory person. Sleep therapy and insulin shock. Nevertheless, pharmacological treatment for schizophrenia began in the 1920s. In Zurich, they started treating schizophrenia with sleep therapy using barbiturates. The logic behind this is still not very clear. One could assume they thought it might somehow calm or reset the nervous system, or perhaps through sleep, subconscious anxieties would surface and lead to healing. But the outcome was the same. The method didn't bring success. Moreover, deaths occasionally occurred due to overdoses, and patients developed dependence on the drug. And then a new remedy was found. In 1922, insulin was used for the first time, initially saving the life of a boy in a severe stage of diabetes. But Manfred Sockel, conversely, managed to turn this life-saving substance into a tool of, well, death, although seemingly with good intentions. In 1933, he was working at a psychiatric clinic for heroin addicts in Berlin and began using insulin to reduce withdrawal symptoms in addicts. Firstly, insulin lowered blood sugar levels and could positively affect the appetite of patients with poor appetites. And secondly, the new remedy seemed so miraculous, and in fact it was, that people hoped for its miracles in other areas to expand its influence, so to speak. The precise logic here is still unclear. However, Sockel supposedly saw a positive effect, and then, moving to Vienna and working with schizophrenia patients, began applying this method to them. He called it insulin shock therapy. The essence is this: our cells vitally need glucose. It's essentially fuel. It's especially crucial for the brain, as it needs it constantly without interruption in a specific amount. Insulin is a hormone that helps glucose enter cells. Without it, glucose remains in the blood, not absorbed, and doesn't enter the cells. In cases where insulin isn't produced, it's injected artificially. However, if too much is injected, especially into a healthy person, the body rapidly absorbs all that sugar, and blood sugar levels can drop too quickly. Consequently, the constantly hungry brain won't get enough, and it will shut down. That's the point of insulin shock therapy. Blood sugar levels drop sharply, and the person falls into a coma. This shocking treatment method is depicted in the film A Beautiful Mind. The horror is that a course of treatment could consist of 30 to 60 such procedures. Doctors, of course, carefully monitored breathing and other vital signs as best they could, and when they realized things were going too far, they would inject a glucose solution to bring the brain back. Nevertheless, the mortality rate from such therapy was up to 5%. Insulin therapy existed in the USA and Europe for about 30 years, despite an article appearing in The Lancet in 1953 proving that there was no basis for using such therapy, a conclusion all subsequent studies confirmed. Just imagine, people suffered senselessly for 30 years. Unfortunately, there were places that didn't believe any study results. Electroconvulsive therapy. Back in the 1930s, this wonderful method had a competitor, electroconvulsive therapy, ECT. Treatment with seizures was practiced even in ancient times when Greeks and Romans treated epilepsy with electric fish, electric rays. In the case of schizophrenia, they stumbled upon this method purely by chance. Ladislas J. Meduna, a neurologist from Budapest University, noticed that many patients seemed to get better, not necessarily from the medications they were given, but after they experienced convulsions as a result of taking those medications. Initially, experiments began with camphor and cardiazol, which caused those same seizures in overdose. However, they also caused fear and anxiety. But from the 1940s onwards, electricity began to be used for convulsive therapy. And you know what? Despite all this sounding quite wild, almost barbaric, it actually showed results. It was noted that with ECT, many patients with catatonia were able to return to normal life after some time, and in some patients with depression, it was cured completely. Wouldn't you be cured of anything if you didn't want to repeat that? The procedure wasn't pleasant, of course. Sometimes the seizures were so strong that patients suffered muscle tears or bone fractures, plus incontinence during the procedure. And when it was over, some experienced temporary memory loss, though fortunately, it usually returned. In short, the beginnings of effectiveness, but to say the least, unpleasant and not entirely safe. But the problem here, of course, was that it was often used not just in severe cases. In the 1940s in the USA, you could get this therapy in regular clinics. And in Nazi Germany and Austria, this method simply became a tool of murder disguised as treating the sick. So over time, the reputation of this method became questionable. The neuroleptic revolution. Fortunately, a new remedy came along. In 1950, chlorpromazine was discovered. Initially, it was used in anesthesia, but then a surgeon discovered that the drug generally affected the psyche, causing detachment and indifference. Soon, it began to be used as a sedative and for treating schizophrenia. In the same decade, other similar drugs appeared, like haloperidol. This group of drugs was called neuroleptics. And despite the fact that they didn't really solve the problem of negative symptoms, like depression and slowness, they were quite effective in combating delusional states, agitation, and hallucinations. And things got much better in the 1990s with the advent of atypical neuroleptics. These medications allowed for a more individualized approach to treatment, depending on the symptoms, and helped address both positive and negative symptoms. Although, of course, side effects are present, and there are quite a few of them. Today, schizophrenia is treated with neuroleptics, or as they are also called, antipsychotics. Cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT, helps patients become more aware of their peculiarities and learn how to manage them. But it's important to understand that in extreme cases, EC is still used. The dangers of untreated schizophrenia. All this treatment is very important because in severe cases, schizophrenia can lead to very bad consequences, and perhaps becoming a delusional vagrant and frightening passersby with strange pronouncements isn't the worst outcome. People suffering from schizophrenia often attempt suicide due to the inability to cope with delusional states or depression. Plus, the question of whether people with schizophrenia are prone to violence remains debated. In fact, studies show they are 14 times more likely to be victims of violence. But who cares about that, right? As long as it doesn't affect us. So, when a person with this diagnosis is found guilty of murder, which also happens, it gets maximum publicity. For example, Vince Lee, who seemingly never exhibited any aggressive episodes and was married, beheaded, and attempted to eat a stranger he saw on a bus. According to him, voices told him the man was an alien who needed to be destroyed. Instead of prison, he was naturally placed in a psychiatric center. According to a psychiatrist who later spoke with him, Vince said he started hearing voices 4 years before the incident. Before that, he was a software engineer with a beloved wife, having moved from China to Canada. But while working a side job at a church, God spoke to him, saying he was the second coming of Christ, and his mission was to save people from an alien invasion. Things escalated from there. His wife recalled him periodically crying and telling her about his visions. Vince's behavior became increasingly strange and chaotic. One moment he'd walk off down the highway, the next he'd return to China, then divorce his wife. According to his wife, his mental abilities had also significantly deteriorated by then. Sadly, unlike some of the earlier stories I told, this one is real. And if his relatives had taken the problem more seriously, the tragedy could likely have been avoided. Although I won't judge them. It's hard for us to even imagine what it's like when your loved one is losing their mind and absolutely refuses help, as was the case with Vince Lee, who said he had a fear of hospitals and refused to go anywhere. And it's incredibly difficult to force someone against their will. Stigma and hope. Such cases, while shocking due to their brutality, are nonetheless rare. Remember, I said people with this disorder are much more often victims of violence? The things these people had to endure in the 20th century. And even in modern society, people who are in therapy and can critically perceive their illness are often forced to hide it from others because many people simply won't accept it, will be scared, will treat them worse, and so on. Many people battling schizophrenia are simultaneously battling the stigmatization of this disorder, a double burden. Patty Duke, an actress, started her TED Talk with the phrase, "My name is Patty Duke, and I am mentally ill." She had bipolar disorder, but the point about stigma is relevant. John Nash is an amazing example of someone who seemingly recovered from delusional ideas through the will of his own mind. It seems he simply became aware of the illness and learned to ignore its manifestations. But in practice, becoming aware of all this and learning to work with it is incredibly difficult, frankly. Thanks, Nash. Towards old age, Nash did return to a relatively normal life, worked at the university, gave interviews, received prizes like the Nobel. But this doesn't happen for everyone. Typically, when a person stops treatment, all the symptoms return, and they are unable to perceive them critically. However, John Nash later believed that while schizophrenia caused him certain troubles, to say the least, it also gave him a lot. Good scientific ideas would not have come to me if I thought like normal people, he said. Now I think quite rationally, like any scientist. He also said, I wouldn't say that this causes me the joy that a person recovering from a physical illness experiences. Rational thinking limits a person's perception of their connection to the cosmos. And if you have more questions than answers after this video, that's perfectly normal. You might feel like the video was quite dense. We tried to make it that way so your brain wouldn't explode. That's how unique, not fully understood, diverse, and therefore interesting this illness is. If you feel that way too, then please feel free to hit the bell icon for all notifications on the main page. And while you're there, scroll down and check out any playlist you like. You're sure to find something to match your mood. Wow, we went deep today. Schizophrenia is a complex and often misunderstood topic. What surprised you the most about its history, symptoms, or treatments? Share your thoughts and any questions you have in the comments below. Let's keep this conversation going. If you found this exploration insightful, even a little challenging, please give it a like to support the channel. And if you want to keep learning about the mysteries of the human mind and the world around us, make sure you're subscribed and have that notification bell rung so you don't miss our next video. Thank you for watching. See you in the next one.